Ladysmith, probably in early May, proudly holding his new AR-15. Up until August 25th, 2020, this is the only time he'd ever fired that gun. Maybe put 100 rounds through it or so at that property up there with Dominic Black. They purchased that gun on that same trip. The defendant admitted he knew as a matter of law he could not buy that gun because he was only 17. Yet he wants to tell you that he thought legally he could possess it, which didn't make a lot of sense to me. We don't have a lot of defendants come in and say, well, I possess cocaine. I knew I couldn't buy it, but I thought I could possess it. No, it's not the way it works. Dominic Black conducted what we call a straw purchase for the defendant. He purchased that gun for someone who was not legally allowed to purchase it for themselves. I'm prosecuting Dominic Black for that, as you know, just like I'm prosecuting Joshua Zeminski. Because what Dominic Black did was wrong, and we don't tolerate that. The agreement was Dominic Black was going to keep that gun until the defendant turned 18. It was Dominic Black's gun. It was legally his. And the defendant knew that it was going to be held onto until he turned 18, that he was not going to have it until that birthday. I want to focus a little bit on this AR-15 because I think it's important when you consider the recklessness of the defendant's conduct, how much he knew, cared, or didn't know about this deadly weapon. He'd only fired it that one time, maybe 100 rounds through it. He loaded the gun with full metal jacket ammunition, which I'll talk about a little bit more. He wanted it because he said it looked cool. Didn't seem to know or care much about the type of ammunition or the type of gun. You had a couple of witnesses tell us in this trial, and I could not believe it. A gun is a gun is a gun. Don't even start with that. And a bullet is a bullet. No, it is not. It is not. And anybody who says that is ignorant and reckless. Because there are some important distinctions here. Full metal jacket ammunition is capable of piercing body armor and squad cars. And you heard Officer Krieger testify that when they heard someone was running around with a rifle, he went and got his plate armor out of the back because their regular body armor wasn't going to stop those rounds. Ryan Balch talked about how full metal jacket ammunition is designed, and this is a former Army infantryman, is designed to go through a target like a deer or a person and continue on. He says it can hit a target 550 yards away. That's 5.5 football fields. And he explained that he had a handgun that night, which he put hollow point ammunition on. And that's what he was planning on using for self-defense. Because hollow point ammunition acts differently. It's going to hit its target, but it's not designed to continue on and go through and hit other targets. So you will hit what you hit, but you're not going to put the rest of the community at risk, especially on a night when there are hundreds of people out on the streets in our heavy residential area. We can see on that map the car source, there are houses, there are churches, there are daycares, there are schools nearby, and you're firing full metal jacket ammunition around. I submit to you, ladies and gentlemen, that that AR-15 had no lawful or legitimate purpose that night. Now, the Second Amendment allows people to carry guns. That is true. There are people who can't carry guns, convicted felons, for example. But, generally speaking, I'm not saying people don't have the right to carry a gun. What I'm saying is that AR-15 did not accomplish any of the goals that these folks said it was going to. So, for example, Ryan Balch says the handgun is what he was going to use for self-defense. Several witnesses agreed you can't point this gun or shoot this gun at people to protect property. So if you're going to protect the car source building, how is this gun going to help with that? The defendant has admitted the gun was useless when he was going to treat people as a medic because it got in the way. He had to take it off and hand it to someone. So you can't use it as a medic. You can't use it to protect the building. So what's it there for? Well, It looks pretty imposing, and it has some deterrence value, but Jason Lukowski, Dominic Black, and Ryan Balch all said they never actually intended to use their guns. So why is it there? The defendant was wearing a sling that night. He purchased that sling at Jelinski's that afternoon. The purpose of the sling was so the gun couldn't be taken away. Wouldn't fall off, he wouldn't lose possession of it. It was designed to help him retain possession of that gun. And he loaded it with 30 rounds, the full magazine, capable of killing 30 people or more. Why do you need 30 rounds of full metal jacket armor to protect a building? This AR-15 is completely incompatible with the role of a medic. Richie McGinnis testified he's been to demonstrations in Seattle, Portland, Washington, D.C., New York, Minneapolis. He's never seen anyone walking around claiming to be a medic with an AR-15. And certainly when you see someone like that, it doesn't exactly send a warm, fuzzy message. Oh, come to me, I'm here to help. And the defendant acknowledged he had to take off his AR-15 to treat people. No serious, credible medic wears an AR-15 slung around their body. That's because the defendant was a fraud. He was not an EMT. He lied. He lied to the press. He's being interviewed by Richie McGinnis, who he hears is a member of the media, and he says, I'm a certified EMT. You're lying. You're absolutely lying. Jason Lukowski and Dominic Black said the defendant had to borrow his medical supplies from us. This is an emergency situation. Everybody's anticipating violence. Everybody's prepared for people to be hurt, harmed, injured, and yet the defendant's going to go there and walk around claiming to be a medic? He's like a quack doctor practicing without a license. That puts lives at risk. And one of the things I had Gage Grosskreutz testify about is that tattoo on his right arm which said, "First, do no harm," which is one of the precepts, one of the fundamental tenets of the practice of medicine. First, do no harm. So how do we evaluate the defendant's performance as a medic that night? Well, on one hand, he wrapped up an ankle and I think to maybe help somebody who got a cut on their hand. Yay. On the other hand, he killed 2 people, blew off Gage Grosskreitz's arm, and put 2 more lives in jeopardy. So, when we balance your role as a medic that night, I don't give you any credit. He showed no remorse for his victims, never tried to help anybody that he hurt, and even on the witness stand, when he testified on Wednesday, he broke down crying about himself, not about anybody that he hurt that night. No remorse, no concern for anyone else. For him to call himself a medic is an insult to anyone like Gage Grosskreutz, who spent hundreds of hours training and working hard to become an EMT. It's an insult. The defendant made a series of reckless decisions that night. Going armed with an AR-15 at 17 years old when he knew he shouldn't have done so, because that gun is normally locked in a safe that he doesn't have access to, and it's not even legally his. He's out after a citywide curfew. He's intentionally and knowingly entering into a dangerous situation, and he expects it because he brings along his AR-15 and some body armor. So don't tell me you didn't know. He brings along no non-lethal means of defense, which means his only option is to kill. I don't know about a lot of you, but I remember that night. I didn't come down here. I don't think most reasonable people did. In part because we all knew it was going to be violent and dangerous. Most reasonable people, to the extent they came out, they were gone by then. Because you don't willingly put yourself in this situation unless you want it, unless you're looking for it, unless you want trouble. Now, to put this in perspective, at this time here in our community, there were people who were scared. There were people who were worried about themselves, their homes, their families, their business. That's understandable. But this is different. There were also people out there who were exercising their First Amendment right to assemble and to have free speech because of whatever they believed in. And they have that right too. But that's not what we're talking about. The curfew, the riots, the arson, the looting that we'd seen on those prior nights, roadblocks set up around downtown, closed exits on the interstates, all of this was sending the message to reasonable people, go away. Don't come down here. Who was left at 11:45 at night? Most reasonable people had gone home before the curfew or never even came at all. But the defendant's down there, he says, because he wants you to believe he's protecting CarSource. Even though he had no actual ties or genuine concern for this building, you have this caravan of people from West Bend, Ryan Balch, Jason Lukowski, Joanne Fiedler, coming down from some other community, having no idea what's going on here in Kenosha, having no idea what businesses are, having never dealt with CarSource before, just injecting themselves into this situation. CarSource that night was empty. The owners testified. They moved all the cars off the lot, they took the tools out from inside, and they didn't even feel the need to protect that building. So who's there? These guys with their AR-15s are just wannabe soldiers, acting tough, trying to manufacture some personal connection to this event, furthering their own personal agenda. Just a small part of the deluge of chaos tourists we saw here in Kenosha, trying to feed off of what we were going through. Despite everything we did to try and tell them, go away, stay out. Did those owners, Sam and Sal, ask anyone to protect their business? You know, I called them to the stand because I wanted you to hear from them. I had their statement, but I wanted you to hear from them. And I'm sure you formed your own impressions about them. I'm not here to tell you that I believe what they said on the witness stand. I don't think it really matters much, except I wanted you to have a flavor of who these people were and what was going on at that building. What was interesting to me is that text message from the defendant to Sam asking for the address of CarSource, even though the defendant says he's already been there. It didn't make any sense to me. It's not hard to find if you've driven past there every day. You know, Kenosha is one of the easiest cities in Wisconsin to navigate. It's all east, west, north, south. How hard is it to find this place? But the agreement was the defendant was supposed to stay at the 59th Street location. There's another group at 63rd. It was their responsibility, and the defendant testified that when the shootings occurred at 11:45 or 11:50 at night, he didn't even know if that other group was still there or if they'd left. But crucially, you heard the testimony of Kriston Harris, who's out there reporting for his Rundown Live, and he's making some video, and he tells the defendant, stay on your property. Don't go out in the streets and engage with these protesters because you're just making it worse and you're escalating this. Just 20 minutes before the shootings. Kriston Harris probably said that because he knows this is a crowd that is feeling threatened by the defendant and his group. Richie McGinnis testified when he left the Stella Hotel and immediately ran over to 59th Street, he saw guys up on the roof and he felt threatened. These guns, he said, were the thing that changed the dynamic for him. Drew Hernandez, we showed video of Drew Hernandez having laser sights pointed at him. And he said he felt threatened. He thought someone was pointing a gun from the roof and putting his life in jeopardy. These are two people who are veterans. They've been to protests in Seattle, Portland, Washington, D.C., New York. They've been through this before. And yet here in little old Kenosha, the defendant's group made them fear for their lives. That's the kind of impact these AR-15s had. The crowd is yelling at the defendant's group, stop pointing your guns at us. Stop pointing these laser pointers at us. And the defendant sees this. He's well aware of the fact that the crowd out on the street is hostile. They don't react well to him. And he knows that by 11:35 at night, this crowd is all the way down there south of 60th. That's where they're at. So if I go down there, I need to be prepared and I need to expect that these folks are not on my side. Joseph Rosenbaum. He's dead, so we don't know what he was thinking. We don't know what was going on in his mind. That makes him an easy target for the defense today because they can stand up here and pile on him and destroy his reputation, and he can't speak for himself. That happens a lot in homicide trials. Blame the victim who can't speak for themselves. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about Joseph Rosenbaum, and you've heard some testimony about him. He had been in the hospital, left it that day, had a clear plastic bag with his possessions, toiletries, a water bottle. We've all seen this. You get it in the hospital, it's pretty common. He's walking around like it's pretty much his only possession in the world. He visits Carrie Ann Swart, his girlfriend, and then happens to wander downtown into the middle of civil unrest. No indication he planned to be there. No indication he's part of any sort of movement. He just happens to stumble into it. So what does he do that night? Oh, let me tell you all the awful things Joseph Rosenbaum did. He tipped over a porta potty that had no one in it. He swung a chain. He lit a metal garbage dumpster on fire. Oh, and there's this empty wooden flatbed trailer that they pulled out in the middle of the road, and they tipped it over to stop some bearcats, and they lit it on fire. Oh, and he said some bad words. He said the N-word. If he were alive today, like Joshua Zeminski, I'd probably try and prosecute him for arson, but I can't because the defendant killed him. But that's the way we deal with people that do these things. When you commit arson, we prosecute you. We don't execute you in the street. And I'm not here to say that the things that Joseph Rosenbaum did were good or that I condone that kind of behavior. Not at all. But he didn't deserve to die for it. You can't kill someone for these things. He's 5'4", 150 pounds. Jason Lukowski characterized him as a babbling idiot. Lukowski says, I turned my back and walked away. This guy wasn't even a threat. I think we all know somebody like Joseph Rosenbaum, the Napoleon complex, the little guy who just wants to chatter, but when it comes down to it, it's all bark. It's no bite. It's like a little dog. Bark, 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 bark. But really, ain't gonna do anything. There is no dispute in this record that at no point that night did Joseph Rosenbaum hurt anyone. Never had a gun, never had a knife, never had a bat, never had a club. And in the Drew Hernandez video, that fight at Ultimate Gas that we showed you, he's being shoved around by the crowd like a rag doll. And yeah, he's mouthing off, he's talking a lot, but he doesn't actually threaten anybody, doesn't actually hurt anybody. They're pushing him around like he's a tiny little person, which, frankly, he was. And in the background of this video, you will hear somebody say, point your gun at me, or something like that. That's Joseph Rosenbaum. He's upset because somebody pointed a gun, and that triggers him, which is understandable. I think most of us would be triggered by that sort of thing. And that's what's upsetting to him. But he gets right in the face of people who have AR-15s. Never reaches for their guns, never rears back to punch anyone, never even lays hands on anybody. You're going to watch this confrontation here at Ultimate Gas, and I want you to keep in mind that there's a group of people on one side with AR-15s and a group of people on the other side. And none of the people with the AR-15s feel their life is in danger. None of them shoot their guns. They can handle themselves. The defendant can't. That sound you heard was somebody throwing some sort of plastic thing at one of the stanchions underneath the gas station, and it makes a sound that almost sounds like a gunshot. So add that into the mix. You've got people with guns, loud voices, clear hostility, and the sound of something that, frankly, to me sounds like a gunshot, and yet everybody keeps their cool. Nobody hurts anybody. Nobody fires a gun. And watch how they push Joseph Rosenbaum around like a rag doll. This guy in yellow, he's going to shove Joseph Rosenbaum about 8 feet away. I guess it was a different guy that did that, but they're shoving him around like a rag doll. Nobody feels threatened by Joseph Rosenbaum. He's not reaching for anybody's gun. He's a mouthy little guy. He's a little dog that barks. Going to do now, he's going to tell him, hey, I need to go grab my bag. I don't have my bag. So they let him on through. To reach down and grab his bag off the ground. That's Joseph Rosenbaum. You've heard testimony that he tells people, shoot me, asking them to shoot him. I'm curious how that's a threat to anyone else. He's triggered, as we saw in that video, by people pointing guns at other people, which is reasonable. Most people would feel that same way. And then we get to the crux of the defense, this threat that he supposedly made to the defendant. The defense would love to be able to play you a video of this threat. They would love for you to see it and hear it yourself. This is a night in which there are dozens of people out there, reporters and regular folks who are recording with their cell phones and with other cameras all night long. We have shown you video of almost every minute of the defendant's night from multiple different angles. And yet, you have not been shown a single video with this threat. Nowhere. It's not out there. Ryan Balch testified, and we have his transcript. We have his testimony, and what he says is there was an incident in which Dustin Collette had put out a dumpster fire, and Balch steps in, and he has an exchange with the protesters, and he turns around, and Rosenbaum is right there in front of my face yelling and screaming, and I tell him to back up, and he goes, you know what, if I catch any of you guys, blah, blah, blah. So that's the timing, according to Ryan Balch, right after that dumpster fire. Kriston Harris from the Rundown Live was there, physically, standing right next to Ryan Balch. Not only was he there during the dumpster fire, but he stays with Ryan Balch and or the defendant for the next 6 or 7 minutes, recording everything. And I've played this video for you. It is Exhibit 18, and I played for you a period of time from 1 hour and 22 minutes to 1 hour and 28 minutes. And I asked Kriston Harris, I called him to the stand, and I said, I'm going to ask you 2 questions. Number 1, do you independently remember seeing Joseph Rosenbaum, hearing this threat? And he said no. And then I said, okay, well, maybe you missed it, because, you know, there's a lot going on. So will you rewatch your video for me and tell me, is it in there? And he said, no. This video captures that entire period of time with Ryan Balch and the defendant right there, and there's no threat. There's no Rosenbaum. It didn't happen. The defense desperately wants this because they've got to give you a reason why it's okay to kill Joseph Rosenbaum. And this threat is critical to their case. But it's not there. In exhibit number 3, and I'll play it for you here as I'm talking. Joseph Rosenbaum isn't even visible. Now, I submit to you that even if, I'm sorry, this is exhibit 18, even if there was a threat made, it's still not enough because Joseph Rosenbaum's unarmed and you can't kill him. But the defense has pinned a lot of their case on a threat that didn't happen and they can't prove. It's not on video. It's not there. So I'm going to pull up exhibit 18, the Rundown Live video, and I'm going to go to that mark.
Don T. Harris here for Rundown Live, and I'm here with a bunch of
Here's the dumpster fire.
Yeah, that's true. Just stay on your property.
Ryan Balch, standing right next to Gage Grosskreutz. Joseph Rosenbaum isn't here. And the defendant and his group are being told an important message. As long as you stay on your property, but don't go out there and cause trouble.
If you go inside. Yeah, if you guys can switch them out.
He's talking to Ryan Balch right now. Goes and talks to a protester.
Problems are right with people.
The rest of the video is the crowd being warded off by gas launched by the police. They launch tear gas, which affects the defendant, which affects Ryan Balch, it affects Kriston Harris, and that group all runs alongside the 59th Street car source, away from the street, away from any protesters. At no point in that video do you hear any threat that Joseph Rosenbaum makes. It's not there. Trust me. If the defense had it, they'd play it for you. Now, they want you to believe that that threat is made, and they also want you to believe that it was something that the defendant took into account when he decided to kill Joseph Rosenbaum. One of the questions that occurs to me is, how would the defendant even know who that guy is? Because earlier in the night, Joseph Rosenbaum is wearing a red shirt and a blue bandana. But by the time he's killed, he's got no shirt on. He's got no blue bandana. This is someone the defendant has never even met before. He's one of hundreds of people in the crowd. And yet, we're expected to believe that in a split second, the defendant remembers this guy? I don't believe so. So then, that video that I just showed you leaves off at about 11:35 p.m. The police have moved the protesters south of 60th Street. They've tear gassed the crowd, and there's no protesters left. 59th Street is no longer in any danger. It wasn't much danger to begin with. There wasn't anything left there to protect. But by this point, there's no more danger. As law enforcement comes through, you've heard this video where they tell the defendant and his group, "We appreciate you," and hand them out bottles of water. As long as you stay on that private property, yeah. No one is saying you don't have the right to stay on private property and protect private property. What people are saying, what the crowd is saying, is stay there. Don't go out looking for trouble. The defendant hears this message from the police and takes it the wrong way. He thinks, oh, well, now I'm junior policeman. I can go run around stopping crime. But I asked him and I asked some other witnesses, if the police are there on the scene and the protesters are gone, go home. Why are you still here? Shouldn't have been here in the first place. But why are you still sticking around? And interestingly enough, one of the questions I've always had in the back of my mind is, what's the end game here? When is this crew going to be done and decide that it's time to leave? Well, right after the defendant kills Joseph Rosenbaum, kills Anthony Huber, and comes back, they all flee like rats off a sinking ship. But it's boring at 59th Street. There's no protesters. There's no action. So the defendant decides about 11:35 p.m. to cross the police line and go looking for trouble. He knows at this point he's entering a hostile crowd. He's seen this crowd. He knows what they're like. That's why he has to yell friendly to them, because he knows they're not going to see him and think he's friendly. And he knows he's got to have Ryan Balch with him, some sort of buddy to protect him. And he's immediately confronted by that man with the yellow pants who says, "You just pointed your gun at me." And the defendant says, "Yeah, I did." He admits that. Now, what's interesting to me is they want you to believe this never happened. They want you to believe this guy in the yellow pants made it up or is lying. But he's just standing there by the side of the road, minding his own business, when the defendant happens to walk up to him. Do you think he just sat there and thought, oh, I'm going to make up a lie about this guy on the spur of the moment? Or did it really happen? And is it consistent with everything else you've seen about the defendant? Does he sound like the sort of guy who would point a gun at someone for standing on a car? Does he strike you as the kind of guy that would threaten deadly force to protect property? Because that's what happened. The man in the yellow pants says it happened. The defendant agrees. And then he comes into the trial and says, oh, I was being sarcastic. Like he's a little 17-year-old and he wants to get out of it. Shortly after that, the defendant loses track of his protector, Ryan Balch. So now he's in a position where he knows that he's surrounded by people that consider him a threat. He knows that he's not supposed to go anywhere without Ryan Balch. He knows he's supposed to go back to 59th Street. And he does. He tries. He walks up to the police line. He says, I work there. That's my business. Which isn't true, but whatever. And they won't let him through. Now, Ryan Balch makes it on through shortly thereafter. But the defendant gives up. He could go 1 block in either direction and make it back easily if he wants to. But he stops and decides, you know what, I'm going to stay here and maybe see what's going to happen. So then he talks to these people with fire extinguishers. And he's going to go down to 63rd Street. And he asks one of them to come along. And they say no. Now at this point, he doesn't have Ryan Balch. He knows he's supposed to go back. He knows he's supposed to have a buddy. And yet he decides to go it alone. He decides to run down to 63rd Street or walk down to 63rd Street. Doesn't even know if that other group is still there. Doesn't even know if he's really needed. But he can't wait to take this opportunity to go down and confront people. Because he thinks he's some sort of cop, some sort of law enforcement agent, some sort of junior cadet who's out there with the responsibility to fight crime. Nobody asked him to do that. Nobody gave him the right. Nobody deputized him. Ryan Balch says, the police told me the crowds, we're going to push them down by you, you're going to deal with them. The Bearcats hand out water and tell him he's appreciated. As he's crossing the police line, they warn him about people throwing rocks. What is the message the defendant takes from all of this? The wrong message. Oh, well, now I've got the power. I've got the gun. I'm going to go confront these bad guys. I'm going to stick my nose in things. So what does he do when he gets down to 63rd Street? The first thing he does, we showed it to you at the very beginning, that drone video. Grabs that gun and points it at someone to protect property. Points it at the Zeminskis. Because why? Because they're, what, about to mess with some sort of fire? They're not threatening anyone's lives. He doesn't need to protect anyone. He doesn't need to protect himself. He's pointing a gun because he thinks he needs to protect property. He says he wants to put out a fire, but the first thing he does is drop the fire extinguisher on the ground. His AR-15 isn't going to put out a fire. So why is he really there? And we all agree, you can't use or threaten deadly force to protect someone else's property. You are here to decide whether or not his actions are legally justified, not to buy pathetic excuses that might be given to you. As a teacher, when a student says to you, the dog ate my homework, that's an excuse. It doesn't get you out of the homework assignment. If you panic in a situation that is not reasonable, that is an excuse. It is not a legal justification. If you're 17, if you don't have training or experience, if you put yourself in a situation where you're in over your head, if you're scared, those are excuses. Those are not legal justifications to kill. They do not erase your personal responsibility for your own actions. The court has read to you the instructions in this case. They lay out the law that you should apply. That reading took a long time, and I understand there was a lot to digest. And one of the things that you will have the opportunity to do when you go back and deliberate is read through those instructions yourselves. Because I get that listening to them doesn't always make it clear. But I encourage you to focus on some things when you consider the defendant's behavior in this case. You are told that criminally reckless conduct is conduct that threatens other people's lives and poses an unreasonable and substantial risk to other people. There is no dispute the defendant's activities here threatened other people's lives. He took 2 lives. You know, this is not like a normal murder case. A lot of murder cases we're in here trying to convince a jury that the defendant killed somebody. That's not in dispute here. That's the easy part. The question is, does he get a pass? Do we think that's okay? Do we think what he did was right? That's the question you have to answer. And when you consider whether his conduct was criminally reckless, consider, did it pose an unreasonable and substantial threat to the safety of others? Count 4 charges him with first-degree intentional homicide of Anthony Huber. There is no doubt that the defendant intended to kill Anthony Huber or committed conduct that he knew was practically certain to kill Anthony Huber. That gun was pointed at Anthony Huber's lower left rib cage, and the defendant deliberately pulled the trigger. That was no accident. And when you do that with an AR-15 against someone's body, it is practically certain to kill. We all know this case comes down to self-defense. But there's a high bar for using deadly force in a self-defense situation. The law says that the defendant may intentionally use force which is intended or likely to cause death or great bodily harm only if the defendant reasonably believed that the force was necessary to prevent imminent death or great bodily harm to himself. So did Joseph Rosenbaum pose an imminent threat of death or great bodily harm to the defendant? No way. Did Anthony Huber pose an imminent threat of death or great bodily harm to the defendant? Absolutely not. Did Jump Kick Man or Gage Grosskreutz? No. None of these people posed an imminent threat to the defendant's life or to cause great bodily harm. The standard, when you make this decision, is what a person of ordinary intelligence and prudence would have believed in the defendant's position under the circumstances that existed at the time of the alleged offense. The reasonableness of the defendant's beliefs must be determined from the standpoint of the defendant at the time of the defendant's acts and not from the viewpoint of the jury now. So put yourself in the defendant's position. Would you have done the same thing? Would a reasonable person have done the same thing? Would you have engaged in the reckless conduct that led to this course of events? Would you have gone out after curfew with an AR-15 looking for trouble? Would you have aimed at other people? Would you have tried to use the gun to protect an empty car lot? No reasonable person would have done these things. The court has also instructed you on provocation. You cannot hide behind self-defense if you provoked the incident. If you created the danger, you forfeit the right to self-defense. By bringing that gun, aiming it at people, threatening people's lives, the defendant provoked everything. And if he does that, he has to exhaust all reasonable means to avoid a confrontation. All reasonable means. So if Joseph Rosenbaum's running at him, Joseph Rosenbaum is no threat to his life. And not only is the defendant expected to run, he's expected to yell, push, shove that rag doll around, run back for help, call 911, call for help, do all sorts of other things besides just turn and fire 4 shots as Joseph Rosenbaum falls helpless to the ground. Ladies and gentlemen, there is no doubt in this case that the defendant committed these crimes. He committed a first-degree reckless homicide against Joseph Rosenbaum. He put Richie McGinnis's life in jeopardy. He put Jump Kick Man's life in jeopardy. He intended to kill Anthony Huber, and he attempted to kill Gage Grosskreutz. All of those elements are true. The question is whether or not you believe that his actions were legally justified. And I submit to you that no reasonable person would have done what the defendant did. And that makes your decision easy. He is guilty of all counts. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Let's take a break and about 2:25 hopefully. And please don't talk about the case. We want you to listen when you come to the trial.
Good afternoon, and thanks so much for